Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast, where we're talking about shame in every and all direction, what it is, where it comes from, and how it affects nearly everything we do, think, and take on. I'm your host, Kira Wackett, and this week we're talking about shame and one of the most insidious and often overlooked forms of narcissism, covert narcissism, and the impact this has on our sense of self over time. My guest today is Catherine Quiring, a licensed mental health counselor and self-trust coach who works with exvangelicals and people pleasers in their journey to identify and trust their desires and reconnect to their inner wisdom. As a reformed people pleaser and exvangelical, this work is personal for Catherine and something she works to embody in her daily life as well as support her clients in. She's passionate about all things shame, learning about the impact it has on how we view and experience our body, the role systems of oppression play in creating and perpetuating shame, and understanding what collective and individual healing can and needs to look like. One of the things Catherine works hard to do for herself and her clients is to ground herself in who she is and the identities she knows influence the way she shows up in the world, and is clear in that as she enters this conversation today, she's showing up with her own relationship with people-pleasing and sense of self. She's also a cis-gendered, white, able-bodied, thin female in a heteronormative relationship. She's a mom, paddleboard, and podcast enthusiast, and committed human to the process of self-knowing and exploration. I can't wait for you all to meet her and to hear this amazing conversation. So sit back, get comfortable, and let's dive in. Catherine, welcome. I'm so excited to be doing this with you. It's been not that long since we met, but it feels like a really long time because I've been vibrating with excitement.
I know. I'm so glad to be here.
So I like to start every episode with just therapist to therapist you can appreciate, just sort of a feelings question. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious for you, if you could anchor on one word to describe how you're feeling right now, what would it be?
I'm feeling a little reactive right now, actually, from some posts and comments that I've gotten lately that I was trying to have my own feelings about and then give generous responses to. So you caught me at that moment.
I love that you won. And again, this is where I have my sister-in-law gave me this shirt that says, how are you really doing? Or something to that effect. Like, how are you really doing today? Because the number of times that we get the invitation to really respond to how we feel, I think is pretty minimal. Because most of the time someone's like, how are you? And the answer is supposed to be fine.
Right.
And so I appreciate that you just allowed yourself to name that. And as someone who struggles with that still, where it's just, there's the part of us that can walk through it. We can therapize ourselves a little bit. We know that's not about us. We know we can take what's helpful, reflect on our values, leave the rest, but it is still painful. It's still it really weighs on us. So I can imagine for you, at least again, kind of comparing our two pieces, sometimes it almost feels harder because I feel like I should be able to do the work to let it go because that's what I would be helping somebody else do. And yet I'm still human and this sucks and it's hard and it feels heavier than I think it should. So I'm dealing with that shame plus what they said and a whole jumble.
Yeah, I think for me, it's been this interesting, as I've been moving into coaching and sharing information more broadly, as opposed to just one-on-one counseling. It's just a whole different thing to learn as far as interaction. And I've been able to, I think, make my world pretty small and only let in people, even clients that really are a great match for me and that I know I can really help. And they feel really supported by me. And it feels relaxing usually, even though we're dealing with trauma every day. I'm dealing with trauma every day, but it's still I love being in that space. And it's been an interesting journey to figure out, I've done so much work in my internal world that it feels really safe and wonderful and vibrant. And my next challenge right now is that of how do I unleash all of these things that I've learned and I want to share in a way that also has enough boundaries with all these like random like comments and other people's reactions and stuff that can come in that can feel like a lot to me. So that's kind of why my like business and like emotional, like, growth questions for myself right now.
Oh, I love that. And as a recovering people pleaser, it's that idea too of getting okay with someone's comments. And I think it was in my master's program where one of the professors that I was working with, she's like, I said, well, I want to have my own business. I was breaking into the speaking world at that time. I already had an art business, and there's, people like and hate art all the time. And I had sort of a different piece of that because my art was really just for me. Like, it was cool that I was making a little bit of money. I was never trying to make it as an artist and have that be my primary income. But when I was talking about, if I'm putting myself out there, if I'm taking a stance on things, if I need to learn how to not be so excited by the approval, because you can't take in the positive comments without also taking in the negative. But in the same mindset, I don't want to put my head in the sand and never listen to what anybody else has to say. And I'm like, how do you do that? And one of the things she said to me that really still sticks with me is, you want to have different opinions be expressed in the world, and you're creating space in which you can allow for that to happen. You can guide it. You can set boundaries on how and when somebody can talk to you, what that looks like. But if you're never willing to take a position, if you're never willing to have a belief or to assert it, you're just coasting through, and change can't happen there. And so I try really hard when I get the feedback about something I've done, or especially like it's a speaking event, and I had somebody who really hated that I swore one time in the presentation, and I was like, okay, cool. But all I heard the first time I went through it was like, you're a terrible speaker. They shouldn't have paid you. They're regretting doing this, and they've signed a contract to do another one. They're probably figuring out how to get out of it, instead of being like, it's okay that they don't like that. I did something that goes against what they do and how they exist in the world. That doesn't mean I'm bad. It just means we're different. And so, it's a journey. And so I'm curious because, you talk about the work that you do, and you also self-identify as a recovering people pleaser. And so I'm curious, how did you get to the point where you recognized what you were doing was people pleasing? Because I'm assuming that was just kind of your normal, like that wasn't, you didn't wake up one day and start doing it. It was probably something you did throughout your life. Right. And then how did you get to the point where you can recognize the work you needed to do, and now how you can support other people doing it?
Yeah, I think I probably had the word codependency or enmeshment before I had the term people pleasing. And they can be pretty similar. I definitely was aware of my anxiety and didn't know where it came from before anything else. And I don't think it was until I was in grad school for psychology that I started understanding about codependency and people pleasing, and like any of this stuff, and about how emotions can be information and be helpful instead of something to judge or feel shame about. And so that's really when I started having some language around it. I think I always thought that, and in the structure and environment I was raised in, pleasing was held up as like, at least from my understanding, that was held up as the way to be. That is the best way to be. Is to
because
be
you were a kid? Is that
because I was a kid, to be obedient and pleasing. So like if anyone's seen Happy Shiny People, that like gives you some idea of that. That's a little bit more extreme version than it is a more extreme version than I had, but I had like all the James Dobson teaching. And so not quite as heavy on the discipline, but there's still this idea of like authoritarian responsibility and patriarchy, and a focus on obedience is next to godliness. And so the whole idea is that like, to be called good, you have to please, right? You have to obey. You have to be grateful and honoring and like kind and like whatever good reactions to the people that are requiring that of you, right? Like, so you need to be friendly and pleasing all the time. Like that's basically, and I think there's extra layers to that as being a woman. But I mean, it was the water I swam in. Like, I just thought that I was being a good kid, a good Christian, a good daughter, right? Like, that's what good meant to me, was to be pleasing. Right. And then you have all the expectations of performance in school too, right? Of like, complete the project, do it well, be quiet, follow all the rules, be helpful, like all of those things that we learn that are basically ways to please the people in authority above you.
Right. You existed in all these different systems that were really kind of touting the same thing, which is your job is to condition yourself out of having an opinion that goes against whoever's in control or in a position of power.
Right.
So then you're in grad school, you're learning these things. You knew again that you had some anxiety, you had some of these kind of pressures and fears probably of not living up to these things.
Yeah. Right.
What happened when you made the connection that maybe some of these behaviors, some of these responses weren't as helpful or maybe didn't line up with who you wanted to be, and kind of like starting to figure that out? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I started to give myself permission to feel anything that I wanted to feel. So there was a lot of anger that I had not been able to express for a long time. There was some like burnout response when I allowed myself to not have to keep going in that people-pleasing survival mode. And so I thought I was depressed at the time. I don't know how much of that was just a nervous system burnout collapse from anxiety into what felt like depression, or just, my body needing to recover after that. But I felt like I just kind of wandered through the world and like I was just kind of recovering. And I think that happens for a lot of people, right? When we hit this like, this is different than I thought, and this is what's actually happening, and making sense of it and releasing yourself from the expectations that you had before. Right. And I think especially as people pleasers, we are so attuned to other people's expectations, right? Society's expectations for success, expectations of our employers, expectations of our friends and our parents and whoever, right? Like, we must live up to those expectations. And to be able to, I think some of the ways I first started was just like, is that expectation realistic? Can I like reduce my expectations for myself? Right. But I was still such in a people pleasing mode. And I think it just takes so much time to like disentangle that, dismantle that, like release yourself from those expectations little by little. I think now having more of a like societal framework too for the systemic pressures really helps, because I mean, like, okay, well, that's part of the patriarchy. That's misogynistic. That's, whatever. Like, there's not any reason why I would need to live up to that. There's not any reason why I would need to pay attention to that expectation for me to look respectable or to be quiet or to show up a certain way or whatever. Like, I'm happy being my nonconformist self. Like, I love that. Like, I've always had that streak in me, and it's really lovely to be able to embrace that now. It's really helped too. I'm in the middle of reading this really great book by Tara Ting, who it just came out. It's called Your Body is a Revolution, Healing Our Relationships with Our Bodies, Each Other, and the Earth. And she has some of the best descriptions of our trauma, our nervous system responses, whichever one you want to call it. And the one about people pleasing is just so great. And I think has even added to my ability to see that as like, this was a chronic nervous system response, right? Like, this is how my body was coping with everything going on around me, right? And trying to help me navigate through it. I often use the framework of the Enneagram as well. And that's one of the first things I encountered when I started therapy in grad school. My therapist introduced me to that. And I am one of the numbers as a 2 that's in the people pleasing triad. And so that helps too, that like knowing that not everyone attunes to that as either their nervous system response or as their way of navigating a difficult experience or feeling trapped or whatever that is. Other people are more like aggressive or fight response or freeze response or flight response or collapse response or withdraw, right? Which it can be part of the freeze. So just knowing that like our bodies are just doing their best to navigate that. And that feels really like so supportive to be able to know that of myself now, right? And instead of, I just need to get through this, why are you getting in my way kind of thing, feelings towards, any of my bodily responses or anxiety or emotions or anything like that, right? That they're there to give me information and to help me through the situation.
What's interesting, I think, kind of similarly, but through a different mechanism, I first started studying and really learning about shame in my master's program as well. And I mean, I think anybody that's in this field, as humans, we have pain that we have to sort through. And so part of, I think, your work as a therapist, as a helper, as a healer, isn't to be absolved of all of that or to have never experienced anything or to have it all healed. It's to have an awareness and be open to the exploration the same way that we would want to support our clients. And as you're talking and as you're kind of finding this language, I think two things came up. One was, it sounds like for you, once terms, once concepts, once kind of higher level understandings of what were going on or what could be happening for you were introduced, there was a certain sense of not detachment, but like a freedom of some of the shame of it, because you could see that this is a thing. There wouldn't be language around it if this wasn't something that other people struggle with. And so this is an experience I'm aware of exists in the world. And then the second thing you're describing with those responses in the triangle lines up almost entirely with the three interpersonal defenses of shame, which is moving towards, moving away, or moving against. And so the idea being moving towards is the people pleasing, is the just attuning yourself to what anybody else could possibly need, securing your role of connection by being needed, by being kind of underneath them.
Right.
Then the moving away kind of being more like that flight response, that avoidant response. It could be, I'm going to take myself out. I'm going to make the joke about being fat before you can so that I'm in on it. But it could also be things like, somebody just suddenly not responding to emails, texts, going off the grid for a while because they just can't handle it. So their only defense is to kind of detach from the world. And then moving against that aggressiveness. And the idea there being, I don't know how to get up from this low level. I can't see myself thinking I'm better than this because I just feel like garbage. Yeah. So my response is for you to feel like garbage, because then I'm not, again, I'm securing my connection. I'm securing my place. And so I'm curious, because I know we talked the first time we met offline, even before we hit record, the way you started talking about narcissism to me, the connection to shame, the elements of this. And for many people listening to this right now, half of them are going to be like, oh my gosh, I am a people pleaser, or somebody I love and care about is doing this. But really thinking about the integration of the shame components, thinking about the experience of codependency, people pleasing, where does narcissism come in? How do you draw all those connections? Was it your own healing journey and that kind of like brought you into understanding those terms more? Or was that just kind of your curiosity as more of an intellectual development?
I guess just little by little and what fell in my lap, but basically, so because of my people pleasing and the ways that I had been navigating the world, it's become really important as part of my healing to be more assertive, like put my needs on equal playing field with others, those kind of things. And so I was really passionate about teaching that to others as well. Right. And like helping themselves give permission to themselves for that. And I use that language a lot because I think that's really important for people pleasers, is that I can give myself permission to something. I don't have to wait for somebody else to give me that permission for it to be good for me, because there is this like tuning to like these expectations or permission, right?
Yep.
That other people might not even be attuned to, right? And that I can give myself permission to put myself first, to say what I need, to put my needs as just important as others. And so that led me into doing therapy with anyone that felt like they wanted to improve that and to have more of a voice and be able to trust themselves more. And that led to seeing a lot of people who had who are survivors of covert narcissism. And so that's kind of what led me into that deeper understanding, is from hearing their experiences and then doing a lot of research about it. So Debbie Mirza is one of the my favorite authors that's written about covert narcissism. And just starting to understand the tactics, the power and control and manipulation tactics that are used, that put you in a fog and like keep you in this place of shame and unsettling and people pleasing. For people who are naturally like attuned and empathetic, and that is your way of navigating the world, right? Which, like, even this term of people pleasing, I kind of like to get away from, because I think it can be shaming and it can be a little bit too narrowing. I use it because it is the jargon that's used, but like, I would like to say those of us who have been attuned to others and are so empathetic, right, that we naturally learn how to make excuses for others and to like give them the benefit of the doubt and always want to help them because everyone's redeemable. And like, it's my job to help in order for me to be a good person. So I can't allow myself to do anything that would be mean or inconsiderate or whatever, right? That there's so many of these layers that have taught us to be this way. And people who have any level of covert narcissism prey on that. Narcissism as a DSM diagnosis used in psychology is one that's a personality disorder. Like, you have to meet these certain criteria and everything like that. But I think it's helpful to talk about features of that, right? That like anyone can be on a certain spectrum of that.
Right.
And be very clear that narcissism is not just being focused on yourself, right? Like, I think because narcissism the term has become used more widely, then it gets misunderstood, right? That it's not about somebody being selfish. It's not about somebody just talking about themselves and like not making space for other people. Right. That's a whole different thing and might be part of somebody's like narcissism. But at the core of someone that has a lot of narcissistic features, there is their own shame that they are like, can't even be aware of and can't touch with a 10-foot pole, right? Like they're so disconnected from themselves because of that. And when someone is a covert narcissist, or a vulnerable narcissist is another term that's been used, they are so under the radar with the ways that they are manipulating that it can be hard to see right away. And what tends to happen is they can be really charming with most people, but then the person that they choose to be their source. So especially in like a romantic relationship, if you end up being their source, so the one that they are like getting everything that they want from, they're also the ones that get the abuse, and nobody else sees it and everybody else minimizes it and ends up siding with the covert narcissist. With a person who has any features of covert narcissism, usually their intent is actually to manipulate and hurt. Sometimes there's a lack of awareness about it, and it's their own, like, you know, people like, oh, they were so hurt, right? They were so hurt in childhood, whatever, right?
Right.
And that may be true, and they may be reacting without any awareness of trying to manipulate others or use them, but they are still using others without being willing to take responsibility for that. And so whatever version or level of that anyone you're interacting with, like, that can be covert narcissism. I have extrapolated that to also be able to apply to like a culture or a subculture. So I think a lot of evangelical subculture has a lot of these covert narcissistic tactics because as I was unpacking my own religious experiences growing up, so much of what I experienced aligned with everything that I was hearing from people who had survived covert narcissistic abuse, that the ways that we feel unsettled, shamed, belittled, uncertain, questioning ourselves, all of those reactions that are really your way of knowing that you've experienced that kind of abuse were all the same. There was very little difference. And then when you look at the kind of interactions that are supported and encouraged in these settings, and it happens in other settings too, right? Not just like certain churches or certain like religious groups, but it's really, their intent may not be bad. They may think they're trying to help, right? And the ideology that you're given is that you are trying to help each other,
Right.
But the ways that you're given to do that are so invasive and so belittling and so judging, and that they mirror like covert narcissism in a whole community.
Yeah. Well, and I think even so two things came up as you were talking. One, I love how beautifully you hit on covert narcissism as a spectrum, because when I was pregnant with my daughter, my grandmother, who raised me from the time I was about 12 until she was basically mom number 2, when my mom was struggling with undiagnosed bipolar disorder and a cocaine addiction and other substances too. But there's a whole heap of trauma within my relationship with my grandma. She had her own narcissistic tendencies. Well, this is the word I used to use, was like, and I think now it's more traits would be the word. But when I was a kid, I didn't really know that term very much. Her own, mental health stuff. And my mom, like chronic lying, a lot of behaviors that we see within patterns of addiction. And so both relationships were sort of, I don't know, stressful, tension filled, overwhelming. I had a lot of pain with both of them. When my grandma, she had only come back into my life for about maybe 6 months or a year prior to kind of being in her final few months of dying. And that was only because I was pregnant with my daughter, but we'd gone for like 6 years without talking, because interestingly enough, my aunt who cleaned out her house found a bunch of letters I used to write her. And it was always like, I just want to be on the same side. I don't understand. But it was me trying to talk to somebody who was not aware of just how narcissistic she was. Her intention was always to preserve the story that she had to exist in to protect herself.
Right.
And so I saw it with her, and I was with this therapist trying to process through some stuff while I was going through that, dealing with sort of the grief, I guess, of knowing her passing was happening. But I was getting really angry at my mom at the same time. And that came up in the session. And the therapist was like, well, Kira, you know this. And like, she was very blunt like me. And so I appreciated this. And she goes, I wonder how you can so easily use the word narcissism when you talk about your grandma, but you basically run away with it with your mom, when your mom is like the definition of covert narcissism. And I was like, fuck you. Don't, like, that's not true. Because your defenses go up, right? Like, she's doing her best. She's trying, like, blah, blah, blah. And but it's also, I think, a degree I've learned now, it's a degree of pity that I have for her. But it's pity and pain, where it's this resentment that builds up. And I wrote that down as you were talking too. It's when you gave that permission piece, that permission to have our own wants, that permission to have our own needs. And I wrote down the idea of, it's learning how to not maladaptively overextend. And I think that's a big thing that we don't recognize, is what is values-driven extension and support and love versus maladaptive and shame-driven. And so anyways, as you're describing this, my mom very much falls into that. She has no fucking clue. She has, like, we just saw her a week ago, and something got brought up about our past. I mean, it was 15 years of like me driving to drug houses in inner city Milwaukee, Wisconsin, trying to find my mom, like her breaking into our house with people with guns, like things that happened where it was like, but she tells stories that she believes that she's never done any of these things. And when you try to talk to her about pain, the end of the story always comes back to having to take care of her, because everything is sort of for her. And so it was infuriating. And it wasn't until that therapist kind of named it for me that I was like, oh, shoot. Yeah, because it isn't the picture we have painted, which is typically a cisgender heterosexual male, white male, that's exhibiting these very specific behaviors. It's not just that. It's not just, even when you brought up religion, it's not just church leaders. It's not just cult leaders. There are other people that do it. And I think the part that's really hard for the people pleaser is holding that person or those people or those systems accountable.
Right.
Because in the same breath that I want to, I feel bad for them, and I see their pain, and I see their lack of, I think it's probably willingness, but also in my head, potential to do anything different. And that's like a really tricky piece. And so that was what was sitting with me as you were saying all that. And I think me still learning to process through when we were back there, and she said something about our past. And I said, I'd love to talk to you about what happened, but my trauma story has never had a place in our relationship because you are unwilling to do your trauma work because you're too busy spending the time making sure the story goes back to you being the victim. Right. And you looked like I punched her in the face, and I didn't mean to be hurtful, but it's those pieces. And so I'll pause because I know I'm like kind of bringing up a lot and I'm seeing your head nods go, but I'm assuming you get people like that you're trying to explain these things to, and you see it. But you know that it's a delicate dance to get them to see it, to hold it, and to recognize that that is actually narcissism, even if it's not done of their own conscious volition.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I think a lot of power and control manipulation tactics, like it's not conscious.
Right. Yeah. And it is, I think, even as you brought in the systems piece, it's funny now, my 3.5-year-old, whenever we talk about, I try really hard not to say like the bad guy when she sees a movie.
Yeah.
The person who doesn't make the best choices, the person who does bad things is kind of what we try to say. And it was funny because after every movie, of course, the therapist is like, let's process what they were all feeling and what was going on. And she drew her own conclusion after she had seen a few movies where she's like, so everybody just wants power and money. And I was like, oh, she was like 3 at the time. And I'm
wow.
Okay. So, yep, that's like pretty much the system. And I'm curious when you talk about that and you think about these larger systems now, and you think about, we mentioned the patriarchy, we could talk racism, we could talk religion, how so much of that is rooted in shame and scarcity.
Yes.
That's connected to power and money. And so how do you see that coming together, and kind of what does that look like in the work you do with people?
Well, so especially working with people, as I mentioned, that like we tend to be so attuned to what is the right thing to do and what are the expectations of me, and can I meet those expectations? And there's so many parts of us that are just like, push harder, try harder, do this. You should be able to do this, right? To meet those expectations, that a lot of the understanding of some of the systems really helps be able to say like, who's benefiting from that? Right. And do I really need to listen to that? Right. Like,
ooh, I like that question.
Why do I need to work harder? Right. So somebody won't call me lazy, right? Which is about shame. Right. But like, really, when you think about it, why are they putting that expectation on you? So they can make more money. So they don't have to take responsibility because they're not paying you fairly, like whatever that is. Right. Because our society values profit and productivity over people, right? Like all of those things, when you step back and look at like, okay, when you go to the end of that trail, why should that matter? It doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't. You can think about then like very practically, when do I want to like in some ways work with the system, right? And when do I not want to, right? Because we still live, everybody has to live within the society, right? And we can do all the work we can to not be internally confined by it and work to change it. But it does help to be like practical about it, not just idealistic, right? So, okay, like I can understand I do need to do enough work to not get fired, or I need to find a job that supports me better or whatever that is, right? But I am also not going to take on any of the responsibility and any of the like emotional burden of feeling like I have to work XYZ amount as an employee, as a mother, as a like whatever, right? To meet this certain standard and feel good about myself or to be accepted. And so I think that's part of where that comes in. And with internal family systems, it's such a great way of understanding human nature and all the systems that we exist in. And like every layer of the system is pretty much the same. And so it really helps you understand like, oh, this message that I got way up here at this like systemic level is what this internal critic is trying to tell me every day. Right. So that's why it matters. Is that like I have a part inside of me saying you better work harder. Right. Or else. And it doesn't know what the or else is necessarily. Right. It just knows that's what we need to do to be okay. Right. And when you start
we've been too afraid to even know what's the or else. We're just not willing to gamble on it because the fear is just too great. And that's the root of shame that's been indoctrinated in us from the time we're born.
Right.
Oh, well, and so if you were to give like a 1 or 2 sentence, like this is what IFS is, or internal family systems, how would you explain that modality to people? And why is that? Because I think a lot of people, when they get started within the therapy world, they're like, I'm either pro CBT or I don't want CBT, but they don't really know many other modalities. And I don't think the therapy world, I mean, that could be a whole nother episode if we talk about the system within mental health, but I don't think we do a great job of like fully explaining to people what different modalities are and how they affect us. I didn't even literally learn about IFS till I worked in a trauma clinic, and my supervisor worked with people with a variety of different trauma disorders. And I had a problem with a client, and I was like, I am struggling from sort of the ACT modality, some of the shame components, some of the DBT work. I'm missing something. And she's like, here, and hands me this book, and it's life-changing. But so let other people know what is it? How would you describe it? And why does it work? What can it do for people if they learn more about it and work through the program of it?
Okay. So do you want the like version for clinicians or version for lay people?
Let's do both. I'm curious how it would be different. So I want to hear them both now for selfish reasons.
So like a little tidbit for clinicians, I think would be, so if you think about like Kristen Neff and mindful self-compassion, like IFS takes that to the next level, where like you are not just inserting self-compassion into your inner world. You start with curiosity and compassion, which is the mindful self-compassion, right?
Yeah.
And you get to be relational with yourself and take care of yourself. So your core self is what they call it. And you can use lots of different words for it, like your highest, wisest self, your spirit, your soul, like whatever you want to call that. But like your essence is basically everything you've been looking for in these outside people and systems. Like you already have it inside of you. And that is that is one of the jewels of IFS, because you already have, they have like a bunch of different characteristics. And I always forget a few of them, but compassion, creativity, connectedness, curiosity, courage, confidence, calm. There's a few more choices, playfulness, like perspective, clarity. That was the other one. You already have that inside of you. And the reason you can't get to it is because of all the burdens that are standing in the way. And so all the different other parts of us that we tend to think of as like patterns, reactions, emotions, body sensations, we could think about them like they are not just that one static thing. Like I just have an addictive personality or something, right? Of like, I just have to get rid of that. I have to conquer that. Instead of that, we can say there is a part of you that really wants to help you not feel pain. And it doesn't matter what the consequences are. If in that moment, it can keep you from feeling pain. Right. And so that is part of that addiction, right? It's like, I don't care what the consequences are in this moment. I'm going to jump in because I think you need me to survive. I don't think you can cope with the pain that would come up otherwise. Right. So that part of you jumps in really intensely. That type of part would be called a firefighter in IFS world. And it is there to help you. And that is not actually its core like job and desire in your system, is not to like lead you into addiction or like impulsive actions that then are going to hurt you later. Right. It's actually just to keep you from pain. And then, so like the other amazing thing about IFS is you can be like, okay, I'm going to like, just come talk to you like a friend. I'm going to approach you with some curiosity and compassion to this part of me. And I get to do that from myself. So like a lot of therapies, the therapist is the one that does that. And that does help unburden parts. It does help you feel like you're meeting yourself, but there's a lot of growth potential that's not there because you're still dependent on these other people to help you every time you feel that.
Right.
Instead of like, I get to meet myself there and witness it and say, wow, you've been working so hard for me. I am like, thank you. and you have not gotten any gratitude for that, right? You've not gotten any acknowledgement for that. And so like, let's have an award ceremony for that. Like, thank you for being this firefighter that would rush into the burning building to save me. And what would it be like to explore a different way to help me? Right? Could you help me with this core fear or this core like pain you're trying to protect me from in a way that works better for the whole team inside? Right. And so then that's kind of that shift. And usually a requirement of befriending that part and helping that part of you find a different role or job in your system is that then you have to go to the vulnerable part, which they call exiles, and heal that part, right? Because as long as that pain is it's still in the system, that firefighter is not going to be able to like change or relax. So then you go to the part that's holding the pain that's usually pretty young. A lot of them are holding shame, right? That's a big burden is shame, fear, like the sense of worthlessness or whatever, those core beliefs about ourselves. And EMDR is helpful for the clinicians, right? At getting to those core beliefs, but often they bypass some of these parts. And then there's all these like later reactions or why you can't actually get down to the pain and make enough progress. Because you need to stop and pause and like really spend time with those protector parts that are like might be standing in the way in their effort to help you. Right. So this is also like a great understanding of why we feel like we're self-sabotaging. Right. It's like, oh, it's one part of me that's trying to help me. And then another part jumps in and say like, stop working that way. We got to do it this way. Right. So then we can heal all of the pain. We can let go of it and bring those vulnerable, young, like wonderful, vibrant parts of us full of like life and playfulness back into like our inner system instead of being like shoved down to the basement of our lives, right? That we can like bring them back. And that brings us so much of the vibrancy to life that we're like, why is life just not as satisfying as I like want it to be, right? It brings back the wonder and the playfulness and the aliveness and the ability to be in the moment and like all those things that we love. And I'm going to mention real quick. So like the opposite type of protector from the firefighter is a manager or a controller. And a lot of therapeutic modalities just align with the managers. They say, if you just manage it enough, I can help you manage it. All of the shoulds and the expectations and a lot of our societal expectations are all about aligning with the managers. And so like, we have to bring in the firefighters that are like, what I've called their actual desire, like core role in our system is to hold desire for us, help us rest, help defend us and advocate for us. Like they're really, really important parts of us. Right. And we need them too. We can't just, when we just manage our lives away, we're just left with anxiety. We don't have anything left. Everything else is squashed.
Well, and I think a lot of what you're describing is helping people, again, sort of celebrate. I mean, we do this in eating disorder recovery. It was a lot of, let's talk about why it's so hard to get rid of your eating disorder. And I worked at a clinic where we couldn't share anything personal, which was really hard. And I've worked at other clinics where I could. And one of the things that was really hard for me in that moment was I related to the fact being at that point, I think 7, 8 years in recovery, now like 10 to somewhere between 10 and 15 years, I can talk about it to realize, no, that part of me was super important. And at one point, the only friend that I had that wasn't lying to me, because I was dealing with mom stuff. I was dealing with stuff with my grandma. I was moving all the time. I had lost some friendships, had all these other things. It became this sort of extension of myself that gave me something. And I think even as you were describing that with, that addictive piece, like my mom, and that's where I think the covert piece was hard to accept. She's not lying to hurt me. She's lying because that is the firefighter saying you cannot be seen as having fucked up, because then everyone is going to know what we in ourselves know to be true, which is that you are garbage. You don't belong. So we have to. It doesn't matter that you're going to hurt your kid. It doesn't matter that you've been doing this her whole life. And that is the most painful thing you could do to her in this moment. If I'm calculating risk reward, it's worth that to not have that truth be admitted out there. And I think that's the really tricky part in so much of this work. And I think from a people pleasing perspective, again, the easy thing is, like you said in the beginning, the problem's just me and now I've got to solve it and I've got to figure out how to do all this stuff. But here it's recognizing it's not just your internal system, but I think it brings in a lot of conversation about interpersonal connection and dynamics.
Yes.
And that's another thing I think like CBT and a lot of other modalities miss out on is we got to talk about the connections. We have to talk about those pieces and the emotional elements to it. And so there's so much of that that is beautiful. And I think, like you said, it's helping the individual get to a place where they can start to work within those systems. And that's what I ended up doing with that client. We had a name for this part. We would talk to this part. She would talk to this part in the room. There would be times that say, okay, cool. They're here right now. And when they're here, we've learned you and I can't have a conversation because they're putting up a wall. They're making it so that we can't hear it. What would it look like if we asked them to wait outside? Can you can you do that? And it feels silly. It feels dumb. It feels ridiculous as the therapist, as the client. It is super hard. It's like getting a bunch of adults in a room and saying, put your hands in the air. Like everyone's going to look at you. Like, I cannot do this. This is the stupidest thing ever. But when you can get yourself past that resistance, there is some healing there because like you said, it's a release in so many ways.
Right.
Man, okay. I feel like we are just scratching the surface. I also know that you have kids, you have a life, you have so many other things that you have, booked in your calendar right now. And so just for people that are listening to this, I think maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we're scratching the surface. We're getting them sort of aware of what's happening. You are sort of a testament to the work that can be done. I think your own healing, but also your willingness to name that you have more to do. And so that reminder to people, this isn't a checkbox we're crossing off. This is really truly about learning about all the different facets and parts of ourselves and why and when we developed those responses, when it served us, when it didn't, what we do. And also, like you said, still recognizing that if somebody leaves a job and they started a new job, it's so much easier to set boundaries from the beginning. Right. But when we're talking about these systems, we can't take, I don't know how many people live in the US, millions, maybe a billion. I don't totally know numbers, a lot of them. We can't just pick everybody up and put them in a different place and start a new country. We're working in the job still where we're now having to learn how to set boundaries with decades of not doing it. And so that's tricky. That's hard. How do you find that balance? So what would you, if you can put yourself in the position of the listener right now, just thinking for many of them, they're hearing some of this for the first time. And now they're like, okay, my brain is sufficiently jumbled, excited, curious, scared, overwhelmed. Where do I go from here? What do I do with this sort of ripe energy that is maybe still scared, but is some degree ready to go to the next part? Where do they go from here?
You can get to a point where like your inner world feels peaceful and like supportive and wonderful. And it doesn't mean you're going to live in a utopia, but it means that like through all of my own IFS therapy that I've done, like I don't actually think I have any parts burdened with shame anymore. And I think this helps clarify that like anytime I feel that coming from outside, I know it is a tactic that's meant to make me feel shame and belittling, right? And it is an emotion that I just can work through and keep going. That it is not landing on parts of me that are like, oh my goodness, right? Like we cannot handle that because I've been able to meet them and say like, I love you and like, I support you and like, you are okay. And I'm going to take care of you and I'm going to protect you. And so I don't feel that same kind of dread. And that's why I think even the conversation at the beginning was kind of like, if I just stayed in my little hole, like I would just be like brilliantly happy. Yeah. And I feel like now that I have this like lovely connection with myself and I like am home inside myself and I trust myself and I know that I have my back and I am my greatest resource. I like naturally what comes out of that is like this flowing of wanting to share that with others. And so then that is kind of my next thing of like, so how do I do that in a way that works for me, that honors my energy and where I'm at and honors like my need to protect myself. But I just really want to like give that hope that it might be painful and hard, but like it's worth it. And there is like points that you can get to in your inner world where like I went to a point and I was like expecting just to reach some of these parts of me and their burdens. And instead I found like what felt to me like goddesses, like it felt like divine energy instead, like extra support, even on top of my core self. And like, to me, that felt kind of like a turning point. Like my inner world is a supportive place, and we're just bringing in any other like parts that need help and like helping process through anything that feels awful. And I just really want everyone to hear that, especially if there's so much shame in your system. Like the shame is there to protect you. The shame is there because it has felt safer to feel that shame and turn that towards yourself and feel like you're worthless than to face the possibility that the people outside of you are hurting you, and they need to be held accountable for that. And that you can radically release yourself from any need to hold that or believe that about yourself. Like one of my kind of overarching frameworks for healing is going from like something bad happens, you're like, that's about me, I'm an awful person, right? So that shame, to like finding a space to say like, is that actually about me, or is that person really overreacting? Right? Like, I think what I did was pretty reasonable there, even if they felt hurt, kind of like your example with your family member. Right. And then getting to the point where you're like, that was not about me. Right. So like, it may feel bad, it may hurt, but like, I can work through that pretty easily. Right. And I can be very clear that that's about them without villainizing them, with also having compassion for them. But it is also not my work to do. Right. Right. And so that kind of like emotional detachment there.
I love what you just said, because I think for a lot of people, they've heard the term radical acceptance. And I like that you use the term radical release, because there's a different level of that. And I think getting to that place where we can release it. And the scary part, like I say this all the time, that our shame does think it's being helpful. And I think that's going back to the parts piece, like you talk about. And it's not trying to hurt you. And it'd be like if I let my 3-year-old make every decision for me when I felt angry, I would hit a lot of things, throw some stuff, have a tantrum in the middle of a parking lot. Like she's just trying to feel her feelings and doesn't know what to do. And shame it's a fear-based response. It is coming from this back part of our brain. And so to get to that place. And
part of that is when we do that as kids, we say like, oh, the parent thinks somebody's going to judge me as being a bad parent for my kid having their emotional reaction. Right. So like where we know how to get rid of that in our bodies naturally as kids, then we feel our parents' nervous system around that, or their like criticism of that. Right. And that turns into shame. And I must have done something wrong when you did nothing wrong. Right.
You now, and you're internalizing, and oh man, is it hard? Because I've tried, I'm sure I can't do it all the time. I'm sure there are ways that I'm missing it, but it's like, do not ever make my kid feel bad for having a feeling. We only talk about different types of behaviors that might allow them to more effectively move through that feeling and to keep themselves and others safe.
Exactly.
But that's hard. And I mean, you and I are both trying to do this, and we have these degrees and this awareness, and it's still hard. And so also giving ourselves and other parents grace when you're not doing that. It's a journey, but it is truly that. And I think the last thing about what you said that I just want to recognize is, to be able to not make it our problem to solve means releasing control, that we have to, should, and are supposed to do something about it, and that we can do something about it. And so it's also the sort of radical release of that's not mine. And sometimes people do shitty things and it's going to hurt me. And sometimes the world is going to be this way. And how can I learn to be okay with only controlling the things that I can control, which is my response, my boundaries, my love for myself, all these pieces, I think you so beautifully articulated, kind of thinking through what that healing journey can look like. And that's really hard. That's a really tricky part of the healing process.
Yeah. Right. Well, and I know we need to wrap up, but that makes me think like, I think that space allows you to have more control over yourself and not feel as helpless either. Yes. Because when you're thinking you need to manage someone else's emotions, you are helpless.
Right.
You can't do that as effectively as they can.
No, but then you're addicted to the chase of it. And again, we are just opening the door to like 37 more episodes we could do, which is good because you have done such a great job of building out different courses and supports for people that do want to go deeper.
Right.
And so,
so
for those of you that are like, yeah, let's keep going for 6 more hours, you can by going to Catherine's website. There are these amazing programs. There's one, her signature program is called Trust Yourself Again. It is absolutely brilliant. Such a beautiful introduction to this work. And then she's also got these more specific ones around self-sabotage, internal family systems, covert narcissism. There's so many different opportunities to dive into it. And so again, I think if you are feeling that, man, I wish this was going somewhere longer, deeper for us because I'm ready. This is speaking to me. It's there for you. Take that leap, invest in yourself. It is okay to put time, money, and energy into yourself to do the things that are really going to support you to live the life integrated and fully as you are and were and will be as a person. And so, Catherine, before we wrap, is there any last pieces you want to say to anybody today?
Just feel free to reach out to me and say, like, this is where I'm at. Where do you recommend I start? Right.
Oh, I love that.
I can help guide you, but like from my resources, other people's resources. And I have several like free informational things that I think are really helpful that'll get you on my mailing list too. And then like, I dive into this stuff every week, like really deeply through my mailing list too. So like, I would love to have you there. And Kira, just thank you so much for having me. This was like such a pleasure. It went by way too fast.
I know my brain is like doing this tingly, like it feels like a pop rock, which is the way that I experience dopamine releases. So I love it. And so, yes, it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's great. I love that invitation for people to reach out to you. This is fantastic. And so go to Catherine's website, check out all of the different links that I'm going to put down there. And when she says it's not even just about her resources, but everybody else's, this person is a wealth of information. I mean, the number of different people that you're studying from, learning from, the connections, just even if you want to know where else to go, if Catherine's not the one resonating with you, reach out because she is all about getting you the tools and resources to do the work you want to do. And it is about getting you where you want, not about her own ego and places in that. And so I love it. For everyone that has been with us, this has been another fantastic episode. I will see you all next Sunday. Catherine, thank you again. This has been amazing. And I'm looking forward to more episodes in the future.